Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this special meeting of the Education and Neighborhoods Committee. It's Wednesday, March 3rd at 2:07 p.m. I'm Paul Krikorian, the chair of the committee, and I want to thank everyone for being here with us again this afternoon. Today's meeting will focus primarily on proposals relating to the consolidation of Dunn and related funding issues. Item 3 on today's agenda will be continued until next week. If you're here to provide comment on that item, you will, of course, be welcome to do so, but I'd urge you also to join us next week when we can have a more robust discussion of that item than we can today, given the time constraints of our agenda. Today we'll have general public comment at the end of all items on today's agenda. Public comment, both specific and general, will be limited today to 1 minute per person each time. And then the item-specific public comment, of course, will be after the presentations by staff and questions and answers, but before any action may be taken. So with that, let's identify item number 1, please.
Item number 1 is a CAO, City Attorney, CLA, and Department of Neighborhood Empowerment report on the following options. Feasibility of transferring administration of the funding program to either a city clerk, CDD, or other city agency to manage the funding program and cost savings. B, feasibility of a nonprofit taking over the funding program and cost savings. And C, feasibility of making Board of Neighborhood Commissioners a managing commission and moving Dunn staff under the commission and cost savings.
Thank you. And I'd like to invite up Larry Frank from the Mayor's Office to make his presentation on this matter first. Mr. Frank. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon,
Welcome.
Council Member. Larry Frank for the Mayor's Office. So do you want me to speak to the feasibility of the transferring of the funding program, or in generally the consolidation?
Well, if you wouldn't mind first giving a brief overview of the consolidation proposal.
Yes.
And the policy and budgetary support for that proposal. And then I and I assume my colleagues, if they join us, will have some follow-up questions for you.
That'd be great. I do have a few documents that would be useful.
Thank you.
So,
and if you wouldn't mind leaving copies available for the public as well.
yes, I brought those. So that's this. There's the relevant charter sections, and then I'll keep one for myself, and we'll. Anybody that's interested, these are the documents we'll be working off of. So, context is the budget crisis, right? I don't have to go into details, but in that context, we're already experiencing, dramatic shifts in some of our departments. So we lost another of our accountants today at Department of Neighbor Empowerment. We're down to, Claudia or BH, how many do we have left? 2. We're down to 2 that support our current funding program. In that context, we're trying to really dramatically rethink how it is we provide services to neighborhood councils. And in that context, we are looking at a real sort of sea change about how it is that civil servants provide services and oversight of neighborhood councils versus the possibility of some of those services coming from a kind of a nonprofit incubator type entities in the community, and seeing it more of a contractual function in terms of a department's oversight relationship with our neighborhood councils. So it's very much a neighborhood councils. We long have known they've learned how to walk and then run. It really is kind of moving away from home sort of environment that we're in right now. We're looking to see how it is we can provide those services, and we're looking to make sure that we fulfill our obligations as a city in terms of our oversight of public funds, and we provide the necessary support for their training, as opposed to assuming that we are the people that are going to inspire neighborhood councils to do good work, that we are the ones as civil servants are the ones that are going to best manage the training of them, to see if in fact some of this training and some of this oversight can actually be provided either by the nonprofit world or by themselves in a kind of a mentorship role. So in the packet of materials, you'll see a summary of the direction that we're moving as a city in relationship to the department. We have zero-based budgeted this department, probably more than any department we've ever really gone through, and it's been a very painful process internal to the department, but we've taken it from 38 positions, 2 of which will be e-ripping soon, down to 16 positions. Again, this is assuming it's a consolidation. I think there might need to be some additional positions if it stays as a standalone, as some people are still proposing. But we believe that some of the support functions could be cost allocated to another department, say the community development department, if that's where we end up doing the consolidation of these responsibilities. The second document lays out those 16 staff and the key core responsibilities they would have in relationship to the ongoing support of the neighborhood councils, the 90 neighborhood councils. And then the third page is an updated org chart which has the responsibilities of the commission and then the Office of Neighborhood Empowerment mapped out as part of a newly constituted Community Development Department and Department of Neighbor Empowerment, which would be a department consolidation. I could take a moment to kind of talk a little bit about the legal theory that allows us to do this.
Please.
So you have with you the charter. You have a copy of this with you. I'm sure you've seen it many times. But in the charter, the relevant sections are, chapter Article 9 of the charter lays out the Department of Neighbor Empowerment, and Section 913, talks about the transfer of functions and responsibilities after 5 years, that is allowed. It refers to Section 514 and 516, 514. 514A deals with, and that's on the page, the last side of what I handed to you. Section 514 lays out the transfer of powers for a charter-created department, and we, as long as all of the charter-required, charter-mandated functions are consolidated, we believe that this would be a legal consolidation, and I believe the city attorney is prepared to opine on that issue if asked today. So we believe it's a legal consolidation, but that still asks the bigger question, which is this the right thing to do, which is what is really, I think, in front of the Education Neighborhoods Committee today, and going to be in front, I think, of the full council. And in that process, under Section 514 ordinance from the mayor, it's a 10-vote requirement for, in fact, it to become the law of this city. And so in that context, I'd like to speak a little bit more about the proposal and a few other things that I think it would allow us to do, and including the funding program, which I think historically the Department of Neighbor Empowerment has always had a somewhat of an oppositional relationship with the neighborhood councils. It did create them. The Board of Neighborhood Commissioners, was by ordinance given the power to certify and decertify neighborhood councils. So the Board of Neighborhood Commissioners certified the now 90 neighborhood councils. There was a lot of struggle over the running of elections, and so the best thinking of the 912 Commission, or the City Council Review Commission, which was authorized by the Charter after 7 years, was we should take that function and bring it to somebody who really knows how to do elections. So it was brought to the City Clerk's office. City Clerk is, I think today is their first election, is that correct? Or yesterday is the first election. How'd it go? All right. So, the City Clerk actually knows how to do that. It's been, I think, a really, big thing for the neighborhood councils to have the city clerk step up. It was a concept of, in off-year elections, it was a way to actually make sense of rationalized staffing at the city clerk's office. There are some critics out there still that want more flexibility than maybe we can allow, but I think the city clerk has actually done a brilliant job of figuring out how to interact with the neighbor councils. But that took a lot of the oppositional relationship out between the Department of Neighbor Empowerment and the neighbor councils. So really the biggest current objection and source of anger between the neighbor councils and the Department of Neighbor Empowerment is the funding program. And that funding program is something that it's not just the departments, the department gets attacked absolutely unfairly on a regular basis. If you'd been at the bank last night, you would have heard Jay Handel going after them on incompetence this and incompetence that. And it is kind of frustrating to have seen inside the department and understand how hard they work, that we haven't given them sometimes as a city the support they need to actually make the funding program fully functional as we developed it. But even at 8 people, it was understaffed as it was structured. Now we're down to 2 people in terms of how the funding program moves forward. And we don't know how it is we're going to actually get additional people back. Quite honestly, we can't, on ERIPS, we can't backfill from outside. Based on the way we've structured the actuarial study on the early retirement program, everybody's going to be fighting over any kind of auditor/accountant. All departments are stealing them left and right in order to stay fully functional in this ERIP environment. And this is one of the situations that I think, if the funding program is to exist, which we believe it should, that we need to find another way to deliver that service. And so we're looking very, very closely. We're not going to ask the city attorney to opine on this today, but we're hopeful that we can actually take CDD's experience and apply it in this environment. So CDD has many contractual relationships with nonprofit entities. I think it's useful for us to start thinking of neighborhood councils not as nonprofits, but as a kind of a nascent, nonprofit in a startup phase, right? So what happens with those organizations, the CDD will have a contractual relationship with a fiscal agent or a fiscal sponsor, right? And those are the same entities that we've talked about previously about the possibility of a nonprofit incubator type entity. But so those are the Liberty Hill Foundation, the California Community Foundation, the Community Partners, LA Conservation Corps. They have many, small startup programs that they incubate, and they act as the fiscal sponsor for. It would be quite possible we believe, for the Community Development Department to have a contractual relationship with a fiscal sponsor, for neighbor councils to choose a fiscal sponsor, for the contract between the city, CDD, and that fiscal sponsor to require things like, a monthly report that the neighbor council needs to sign off on, maybe a single soft piece of software that will allow us, that they have to give us on a quarterly basis that gets posted, right? A few minimal requirements, and maybe we need still to do, like we do now, a annual expenditure plan that allows for us to do a kind of a pre-approval approach to the expenditure of those funds, but we would transfer the $45,000 or however much those dollars are to the fiscal sponsor, who would be responsible, legally responsible to the city for those expenditures, right? And I think ultimately the controller has to really see this and weigh in and figure out if we in fact can do this. But quite honestly, it has the same amount of pre-approval as our current funding program with its purchase card that we have in place right now. That's created a lot of the problems and the difficulties and the amount of staffing requirements that we haven't been able to fulfill.
What are the, under the current reorganization plan as it's proposed, what do you anticipate to be the cost savings in this fiscal year, if any, and projected forward into 10-11?
Yeah, I think it's, Claudia could probably give me a better, we're right now working on the budget, not just for the staffing budget, but also the entire budget for the department or the office. And so it has to do partially with, how we would contract out some of the functions, especially the funding program, right? So
have you begun to make some budgetary assumptions?
Yeah, I have something
around
here. I just wonder if I can share this. So it's
Okay.
our first. Claudia, anything that we can share here?
Do you have it right there?
I do. Let's see. Do I have? I'm pretty sure I do. Hold on, you did. I know I'm getting to it, right? Oh. It's in this file somewhere.
We had, Claudia Dunn, Assistant General Manager, we had identified a few areas from a zero base forward in terms of just some contractual services, printing and binding, but that was based on experience as a standalone department. So we'd really want to work with CDD closely and figure that out if in fact this consolidation occurs to figure out.
You would assume that there would be some efficiencies of scale
Exactly.
and some
Exactly.
administrative expense reduction, that sort of thing.
Right.
And obviously, the key savings has to do with the reduction in
Yeah.
staff.
Well, and in that regard, does the mayor's office agree that a thriving and robust neighborhood council program is a core function of the city of Los Angeles?
Yes. And so I would say, that as I would define the core function as I read the charter, it is in fact the advice that they give the city, the mayor, and the council on the delivery of services, on the development of our budget. And those are all things that we really treat more. So even though we've been spending so much time convincing them that they should be doing more, community beautification projects, that honestly is not a core service. The core service is the role they play at advising the city about how we do business.
Right. And similarly, the Dunn has provided some services, some advocacy, some oversight to the operation of neighborhood councils, which has been, by the nature of neighborhood councils, has been often kind of on an ad hoc basis because each neighborhood council is different, and there's been resistance to
The over-managing at times?
conformity, I guess, among the neighborhood councils. So by what process did or have you evaluated what are the core functions that need to be delivered to service the neighborhood councils by either this department or some assemblage of departments?
Right. So I think really truly it is a process of going through Article 9 here, which is these are the charter required functions, and then we as an office working closely with the department have looked at, as we did zero-based budget their program, these are we believe the core functions that are going to be required. So it includes the funding program and how we're going to manage it. We'll still need 2 people to manage that program because of the relationship between the city and their city dollars in terms of oversight of the fiscal agents, if we were able to simplify it to that extent. We do feel an obligation on the training front, and the training has to do with the Brown Act. It has to do with running meetings. It has to do with ethics training. It has to do with treasurers training. We'll still need treasurers that operate, that bring those issues before boards every month on a monthly basis. We do believe that there is that education function can be expanded through a mentorship / leadership program amongst neighborhood council leadership, right? So we do add 3 volunteer coordinator positions to actually support the neighborhood councils at learning how to train themselves, manage themselves, right? And then there is the Board of Neighborhood Commissioners is a requirement, but we also see it as a necessary forum. We need to staff that board. We do have a number of leases, about 48 leases that need to be maintained that allow for office space to allow the neighborhood councils to actually be, we think, functional. And so we see that as a necessary function. Theoretically, we could contract that out, but I think we actually probably are most efficient not contracting that piece of work out in terms of the contracting out policy for the city. Those are there are other pieces, I'm sure. We have some kind of help desk that we need to operate. We're going from 17 neighborhood empowerment analysts down to 4, which is where we're actually finding the majority of our savings in this process. People that spend a lot of time out in the community working with neighborhood councils at the neighborhood council meetings. There's going to be much less of that as we move forward. Part of it is that we've been in a training role up until now. Quite honestly, some of our neighborhood empowerment analysts, are out there and they see things that they don't want to see, and they end up being in an oppositional relationship as to what exactly they can and cannot do out there. We may do less of that, right? We're going to be functioning more as a help desk, less of a watchdog, right, in terms of how we sort of interact with neighborhood councils.
It sounds as though the analysis of the potential outsourcing to a nonprofit of the funding program administration is still under consideration, still being evaluated.
We need the city attorney's final read, as well as the controllers, and I think they're not prepared to give us a response on this latest proposal, because this latest proposal was really, kind of formulated on Monday. At a special meeting trying to figure this piece out between all the different participants.
So part of the policy justification, potential cost savings in this kind of consolidation will be in centralizing the accounting function and the accountability function.
Personnel function, management functions, budget preparation function, human resources functions, et cetera. We think we can, to the extent that we need that, we can cost allocate that as a small percentage of an existing CDD staff person, or just get their help.
And you're comfortable that there will be adequate personnel to either meet or exceed the current demand level for those services with consolidation?
You mean from CDD staff in terms of cost allocating some additional support from them?
In a post-consolidation scenario, yes.
It kind of need to defer a little bit to the general manager and the assistant general managers on that, but we have had those conversations, and we are believing that we can make that happen.
Okay.
Good afternoon. Richard Benbow, General Manager, Community Development Department. As Mr. Frank indicated, we are doing our analysis now as we speak on what is actually going to be required. And of course, until we can finalize what the actual duties and responsibilities are, it's kind of hard to arrive at a conclusion. But let me just approach it in this way. There are several moving parts that we're all looking at and trying to figure out how this is going to work. We have the 16 staff that have been identified to be transferred into the department. We have the responsibilities under the charter, and we have those responsibilities and activities that are outside the charter that are currently being performed. Our resources right now fully fund all of the staff that we have under the grants that we receive. That would be the WIA, the block grant, community services block grant primarily. So anything that we take on additional the staff would have to be fully funded. Any activities that we take on, the funds would have to come from a different source for two reasons. Number one, grant funds are not eligible to be spent on these activities. And the second thing is there is no money to fund these activities. So within the parameters of those three variables that we talked about, we need to find or define the activities for which there is adequate funding to pay for that covers everything that's required under the charter and everything else beyond that that we've agreed that the department will do if it is indeed transitioned to CDD. But also, as Mr. Frank indicated, there are some economies of scale. There are some things that we think we could probably do cheaper than has been done previously, simply because we're organized in such a way to administer these kinds of activities, and our experience in doing it, I think, lends to our ability to find some efficiencies. Assistant General Manager Robert Sines, who is over our operations, has also been looking at this, and I would ask Robert to add anything that he might have.
Real simply is that given the resources that are coming to us, the 16 folks, we would need to definitely make sure that we protect the integrity of our fiscal responsibilities. That's both for our current grants. Through CDD, we manage about $200 million of various federal and state dollars. We want to make sure that the standards that are applied to those dollars are the same standards that we're applying to the $4.5 million that would be in the funding program. Depending on what is required of us and how much restrictions and expectations we're given, the funding allocation will be different with that. One of the proposals that we had talked about, which is to standardize and using a fiscal agent concept with contracts, is something that we're very comfortable with and have past experience doing. And also, I think it gives some flexibility to the individual neighborhood councils to choose their own fiscal agent and processes at a very local level. And we would manage the 90 fiscal agents that will be out there through a contract process.
And the idea of there being some economies of scale to cost allocate support for these 16 staff, that's
Exactly.
unanswered as a question. How would you answer that one?
It's either the cost allocation of the 16. If the 16 is, it's really a fiscal question. If the 16 is the capped amount of dollars, and just for sake of argument, let's say it's $2 million of general fund. If that's going to expect to take care of all the program, we would have to cost allocate within that $2 million. If it's 16 positions plus cost allocation,
Yes.
it would be $2 million, about $2.3 million that we would seek in
And
general
so
fund.
explain the gas function and what else that we would want in terms of support from CDD.
So in terms of our federal requirements of our WIA and CDBG funds, municipal government function is not eligible cost. So the time for the general manager, the time for the assistant general manager, the time for our HR folks and everybody else that will work to support the done function has to be cost allocated. And that would vary anywhere between 5 to 15% depending on the level of connection and support.
But did I understand you to say earlier that you're currently cost allocated entirely to your grant funding?
Right. So we would actually we won't add any additional staff. We would just have to charge the done work to the done grant work order. So if, as an example, my time, if my time is say 10% going to be allocated to doing done functions, I would charge 10% of my salary to the done work order number, and that will come directly out of that budget. They wouldn't be adding any additional personnel on the support side.
And so then you would be billing 10% less of your time to existing federal grant programs.
Exactly.
That's true.
But it is a way of getting a high level strategic, thinker about how to manage these responsibilities, into this equation that has a lot of contract management experience and other management experience without having to pay the full freight of a full-time general manager, for example.
Okay.
But that's the theory. That's the theory behind there being economies of scale.
But there would be, I guess what I was thinking in terms of economy of scale is having multiple general fund funded positions be reduced into fewer general fund funded
There are
positions.
efficiencies,
And what
which
we're
we will
talking about
find.
here is fully funded positions from non-general fund sources being used to service general fund tasks and receiving less reimbursement for those services from outside the general fund, right?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't quite follow that.
Well-
Say it one more time.
If 100% of their personnel cost for managerial and other costs are being billed through to grant programs now that you're servicing, and we're now going to allocate some of their time to administering the done functions, if
Yes.
you will, then some portion of that time is going to have to be allocated to the general fund.
That's correct.
Which means that we will have, unless we're going to double bill, we're going to be receiving proportionally less funding from federal sources and otherwise.
They still get so you want, I'll let you explain.
Yeah, the vast majority of our dollars are allocated to us by formula, so we would still be able to bill up against that. We would just allocate it to different functions and or greater programming in the community. So on the workforce development side, let's say we save $100,000 on the WIA side, we would have $100,000 to put back into community program for the workforce programming.
Or quite honestly, they might have some additional special funds to have additional staff person that would actually operate, as contract management on the workforce side or the human service delivery side.
Okay, that's kind of where I was.
Yeah, so we would
hoping to
fully
get-
bill, and we never return money
No
back.
money
to the
goes
feds.
back to the feds.
But are you going to be able to find a scenario by which we are able to provide, as I say, an equal or greater standard of accounting and auditing and personnel functions and all of those things to the level that we have?
That's our
At least
challenge.
to the level that we have now.
That's what we're looking to do.
So I guess that what is helpful here is that rather than, if we have a specific flashpoint of needing additional support staff, say, for example, when the cases went to the district attorney's office, and so it took a lot of the accounting function to prepare documents for the criminal cases that resulted, it's possible that we could ask the community development department to cost allocate some support staff that we would then use for that function. Rather than to try to hire another person as needed, there would be a cost allocation approach to being able to deal with the ebbs and flows of work in a tiny department environment by being able to cost allocate additional support to CDD.
We seem to be one chair short up at the front here. We don't have as many chairs as we have microphones. No, I would rather have an extra chair put up there if we could, because I'd like to ask Mr. Kim to come up for a moment too, because I want to talk for a moment about transition and what the plan is for actually implementing this consolidation and moving responsibilities over. What extra resources may be necessary to make sure that that transition happens in an effective way? What are the challenges that you all see in doing that, and what steps do we need to be taking in order to address those challenges of transition?
Bangwan Kim, still General Manager of the Department of Neighborhood Empowerment. I believe that in large part this is being driven by the Mayor's office. And this has been done very few times, if at all, in the experiences of a lot of the city's leadership. So I think in some ways we're kind of figuring out how we make this transition work. But from my perspective, a lot of the core functions that the new consolidated division will be providing is based on advice that we provided based on our experiences. It was based on surveys that we've done with neighborhood councils, the education training, help with outreach, moving more towards a volunteer-driven system in terms of helping with the grievances and the training and education is in line with the direction that I had a mind to go to as well. So, the current, my stepping down from my position will take effect when the CDD/done general manager will be appointed by the city council. But during that time, I've been, and Claudia and myself have been pretty busy responding to both council and mayor and neighborhood council and commission's concerns about all these balls that are juggling. And there's a lot of questions. And, Larry Frank is, I'm sure he didn't ask for this assignment, but his leadership is quite capable in terms of steering the city towards the right path.
In terms of the mechanics of actually moving, the pile of papers from this desk to this desk, for example, I assume that there's going to be cost associated with that, that there's going to be that some provision is going to need to be made so that someone who, calls on Monday will have the same response as someone who calls on Tuesday. What plan is in place to make sure that that transition happens smoothly? Or is that yet to be developed?
I think we really are first going to go through the Section 514 ordinance process, which is why we really want to work closely with your office to make sure we do that right. Right, so there will be a Section 514 ordinance that would proceed as early as next week with a transmittal, but we will want to get your full input as that goes forward. It would go to council. It's a 45-day ordinance, so it needs 10 votes during that 45 days to proceed. I think the funding program is something I would like to get started on sooner rather than later, mostly because of the crisis related to the transition of people from the general funded positions to special funded positions, which is creating a crisis all by itself, even if we didn't have this consolidation, idea in mind, right? And then once that consolidation happens, it's our expectation that the 16 staff from the Department of Neighbor Empowerment would transfer to the Garland building and would co-locate with the Community Development Department. There is, I believe, room to house that staff because a lot of the CDD staff have been moved out to the field and actually have there's a strong field component that's been built at CDD. So I think there's quite a bit of opportunity to co-locate the Office of Neighbor Empowerment with the CDD, and then in the actual process, of moving staff and phone lines and equipment is something that the city is actually pretty skilled at from numerous movings of many functions and offices. Yeah.
We would also like to take the controller's audit and use that as the basis to build back the funding program side of it and implements all of the recommendations. And I know the department staff has worked extensively hard to be able to meet all of the controller's audits, but as it comes over to CDD, we would use that as our roadmap to make sure that we're implementing all of the recommendations that come over. Then we also look forward to working with the city attorney to be able to understand what is legally required and what is both management, what is legally required and what is management prerogatives in terms of the implementation. Like I said earlier, we would really like to have the highest standards of the fiscal integrity of the dollars implemented as we move forward.
Well, the council's going to play a role in that too, and in fact, later in this meeting, I hope we're going to talk a little bit about some of those recommendations, specifically the bank card issue, at least in a cursory level. Mr. Kim, I know that you've been trying to develop some implementation of technologies to try to create some cost efficiencies. Can you talk a little bit about those and how those might be transitioned in as well to the new plan?
Well, now that we're down to one IT systems person.
You lost another one there too?
We spent the past 6 or 7 months basically putting as much of our paper-based documents onto our website. So we're hoping to launch the next week or two with a completely new look. It's got training videos on there, so people will have some basic knowledge available to them online. A lot of the information that board members will need will be available in terms of what are their responsibilities. So, this has been a longstanding project for the department, and since I've come into the department, I hated our website. It was so non-user friendly. So the new look is very, very open and much more transparent. So it's very much my hope, and the mayor's staff has taken our recommendation to include enough systems capacity to make sure that we have staff dedicated to making sure that the documents and the information on the website is kept as current as possible, and that more neighborhood councils will ideally over time be interconnected with our website. So about 75% of neighborhood councils have their own websites. So our hope down the line would be that those that don't have websites could rely more on ours. And as part of the transition, we were having weekly meetings with our staff, one to kind of keep up with the balls that are necessary to be juggled, but also what are the core functions that we see transitioning over to the new function, such as the volunteer management program, the help desk, the relying more on our website as a source for providing information to people. Those are some of the things that we think will be very important in a streamlined department. The face-to-face services that we had been providing, with 43 staff positions, we could be a high-touch department, but with 16, that won't be possible. So one of the things that we'll have to work with our commission on is how do we get volunteers more involved in resolving grievances with neighborhood councils? Can we get the commission to talk more about requirements around training and establish a much shorter leash, because our staff will no longer city staff will no longer be able to play a safety net role. So neighborhood councils that get into trouble, the strategy I think going forward from my perspective would be to establish volunteers to kind of help us in the field. And then there's an executive director position, Larry, that you might want to talk about as well.
Well, yeah, so there would be, I think the recommendation from CDD is to make it a chief level position that would actually be the head of this Office of Neighborhood Empowerment within CDD done.
Right. In addition to what we've already said, I think there's one entity, too, that is going to play a critical role in the transition, and that's the Board of Neighborhood Commissioners. We've talked about the Controller's Office, the CAO, the Consul, as well as CDD and Dunn staff. But I also think that we can gain a lot of knowledge and insight and perhaps figure this thing out with some critical input from the Board of Neighborhood Commissioners. Their experience in working in this environment is got to be valuable to us as well.
And I'm going to ask for Bonk's comments momentarily on this, but just see if there was anything else I had to cover. Yeah, I was going to do that next. Okay, thank you all very much, gentlemen. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much for your thoughtful leadership on this as well. It's not a simple thing that any of us are trying to figure out.
Mr. Frank, if it was easy, everybody would do it.
All right. Take care.
Thank you. Now, given that so many of the issues that Mr. Frank discussed in his presentation involved the opinions that the city attorney has to legality of the consolidation issues and some of those ramifications. Mr. King, will you be able to comment on behalf of the city attorney's office on what limitation there may be on the ability to conduct to implement a consolidation of the type that's been discussed here pursuant to the charter?
Yes, Peter King, City Attorney's Office. We have looked at the question which is under 1A, the feasibility of transferring the administration to a merged CDD done department. It's very clear in the charter that you've got to have a general manager of done, you've got to have a done, and you've got to have a board of neighborhood commissioners. Those can be transferred under 514. The plain language, there's no legislative intent that would suggest otherwise. So we're fairly comfortable opining that indeed a merger could take place, but the core functions as set forth in the charter would have to remain. It's that simple. With respect to the feasibility of a nonprofit, we've been in discussions about that. We're not
Just for the sake of identifying this issue, you're talking about the feasibility of essentially assigning the responsibility for the administration of the funding program to a source outside the city, such as a nonprofit of the kind that Mr. Frank discussed,
Right.
the community foundation, those sorts of things.
Yeah, as Mr. Frank mentioned, it's sort of been morphing as to what they have in mind. At first blush, we do have serious reservations about a fiscal agent taking over the responsibility, a fiscal agent to run the funding program, which includes accounting issues, which includes treasurer issues. We have serious concerns as to whether that can be accomplished in the way that they have been describing it. However, we are more than happy to come up with something more definitive in writing, provided we know exactly what they have in mind. With respect to the feasibility of making the Board of Neighborhood Commissioners a managing commission, currently they're not a managing commission in the charter, and therefore the charter would have to be amended to indeed make them a managing commission. They are, just so you know, that they are a policy-making commission, and they also have authority to approve leases and contracts.
Regardless of whether we were to identify them as a managing committee, could we not? Would there be what are the restrictions on our ability to delegate specific authorities to the bank?
When you say delegate, the general manager, it's very specific in the charter. The general manager is handling the day-to-day operations of the department, and there's been some, I guess, flex there over the years as to what's a policy issue and what's a management decision. And in fact, we've issued a couple of opinions regarding that tension, because over the years the board has wondered how far their role goes. So I suppose in operation things could flex a little bit, but it is pretty clear that there shall be a general manager and there shall be a board of neighborhood commissioners, and the board of neighborhood commissioners is not a day-to-day manager.
So just so I can understand this a little bit better, and I'd love to see those opinions, by the way, at some point. If you have written opinion letters on that area, that would be helpful for me to have.
Sure.
The bank currently has the certification responsibility assigned to it. Was that,
Yes.
and I'm sorry, I don't know this offhand, was that pursuant to charter? Was that pursuant to ordinance?
Yeah, that
Was that a charter
That was
responsibility?
pursuant to charter.
Okay.
Yeah, 902.
Okay. Okay, now, there was a discussion earlier about the assignment, and you've already talked about the assignment of the funding program to an outside entity. But there was also discussion of having specific neighborhood councils have fiscal agents. Have you looked at that at all as to whether or not that there's a restriction, a legal restriction
Well,
on that?
we haven't looked at that. The one thing to bear in mind is that there they're part of the city family, and these are city dollars, and the controller is the city accountant auditor, and the treasurer is the city's banker, and these funds are placed into a fund administered by the treasurer. So that's where you're getting into you're butting up against some real issues when you're talking about farming out that work.
Well, I certainly there's some challenging policy issues
Right.
in that regard, but I'm trying to get to what where the legal envelope is on this, so that I can make the determination of what the appropriate policy is with my colleagues. Okay. Now, this consolidation, if it goes forward as proposed, is certainly going to implicate, I'm sure, some large number of ordinances that make reference to Dunn, make reference to Bonk, make reference to the CDD in some way that will probably have to be updated and amended by ordinance as well. I'm not sure if we have any comprehensive list of that yet. I'm sure that's probably still being developed as well, depending upon how the consolidation ordinance itself is prepared. But can you provide a list of that before our next meeting, so that we can, at least sort of use that as a checklist to make sure that we're updating every appropriate ordinance that needs updating if we go forward with this kind of a proposal?
Yes, we can do that, and we've already been toying around with a draft ordinance should this be approved. So we've begun identifying those sections, particularly those related to the funding program, that would have to be modified.
Okay. I think we'll want to revisit a lot of these issues, and I don't know if you mentioned a further opinion. Was a written is a written opinion on any of these issues already in the works, or could that be?
No, there's no written opinion on any of what has been discussed thus far. Although, as mentioned, we feel pretty confident that that there could be a merger if we preserve the responsibilities, and we feel fairly confident with respect to 1C on the agenda that the Board of Neighborhood Commissioners, you would have to amend the charter to actually make them a managing commission, as we understand that to mean.
Okay, thank you. Okay. We have representatives from Bonk here as well. If either or both of you would like to come forward, I'd welcome your comments on what you've heard so far about the proposed consolidation and any alternatives to that.
Al Abrams, Vice President, Board of Neighborhood Commissioners, and I'm joined by Ms. Linda Lux, also Commissioner with the Board of Neighborhood Commissioners. Currently, the board has not taken a action with regard to the proposed merger. We are still in a waiting mode, a receiving mode of information. We appreciate the continuous updates we're getting from the mayor's office, as well as from this committee, of course, and from the city attorney's office. Like the individual neighborhood council board members, we have a lot of questions. We have a lot of concerns, both legal and otherwise, with regard to the functionality of the 90 neighborhood councils if they are indeed merged into CDD, how much independence they will have, and how much abilities they will be able to continue doing the work that they have done so well for the city. With regard to number C on your agenda today, it is the feeling of several of the commissioners that, and I'm going to speak for myself here, that a lot of the quote-unquote problems that we have seen over the last 10 years could possibly be traced back to the fact that this commission, which is staffed with some excellent people who know this system in and out, have never had the ability to weigh in on a management focus. And it could be that some of the systemic failures or concerns could be traced back to that. When you look at the actual charter language itself that our city attorney, Mr. King, said, 902B, the board shall be responsible for policy setting and policy oversight, including the approval of contracts and leases and the promulgation of rules and regulations, but should not be responsible for day-to-day management. My perspective is that's a pretty big umbrella and a big tent. The question is, how far can we go without pushing the edge of the envelope on the charter language? But my instinct is, based on that I think there's still a lot of room left for us to be of value with this potential merger.
And I'd like to weigh in. Linda Lux, Board of Neighborhood Commissioners. Thank you for having us up here. I was a member of the commission during the Neighborhood Council Review Commission, and we, at that point, asked for our city attorney opinion because one hadn't been issued in terms of our powers. We assumed when we took office as commissioners under the new administration that we did have management ability, and we were told in no uncertain terms that we did not. And it's caused conflict because we set rules and policies, but that doesn't mean we have any way to make them be implemented. If the department doesn't, then there's really not much we can do. So if there was some way for us to have more oversight without going through a charter amendment, if there is some envelope pushing, then I think our commission would be up for the job. I think we do have the neighborhood council system interest at heart. Many of us are on neighborhood councils, so we see it from the ground level and the city level. And I think we would take it on and I think we have the respect of the neighborhood councils to do that. So I don't have the answer, but I'm hopeful that there'd be some more room for us to do that. As respect to the city moving to CDD, we don't have enough information, as Commissioner Abrams said. We are all ears. I think we will be at the point to make a policy decision or make a policy, take a position, excuse me, but we're not there yet. So we just want to see whatever direction is gone, that the neighbor councils can be fully operational. We want our funding to be able to maintain a high level so that we can continue our work as neighbor council members. So you're doing really a great job in terms of finding all this out, because we're learning at the same time.
Well, thank you. So under the status quo, Bonk under Section 902 of the Charter has the ability to promulgate rules and regulations, but you don't have the managerial ability to oversee the compliance with those rules and regulations, or any ability to enforce them. Conversely, Dunn is then given the task or responsibility of enforcing those rules and regulations that it doesn't have any ability to help shape, or that doesn't necessarily have the staffing or funding to be able to implement.
Right.
Okay, that's
that's
a managerial problem that needs to be
Well, we do
fixed.
work with the department all the time. As we develop the policies, we don't do it in a vacuum. We do it with them. But once they are promulgated and set as policy, that's the end of our involvement, because we don't have any often reporting back or any sort of oversight.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Mr.
Oh, I just wanted to say that I wanted to make one correction for the record, and that was that the charter itself does not specifically say that they do certifications. That is by ordinance. But, when we looked at this question, it's very difficult to put a hard and fast rule as to what management is. It sort of... So therefore, we tried to outline some parameters, but it probably differs from department to department that's set up like this.
Yeah, and there's nothing quite like this one.
Exactly.
So this is a hybrid situation that doesn't have a lot of precedent either in the city or anywhere else.
Right.
So it does create some challenge.
It's not only a hybrid situation, it's a hybrid situation going into uncharted new ground. And we heard last night at our commission meeting
In Winnetka.
that we took lots of testimony from neighborhood council people expressing their frustration as to the fact that we didn't have the ability to go forward to see enforcement and to see carry through. So, we hear it day in, day out, but we're here to help. We're here to be as valuable as we can, not only to this committee, but also to the administration of CDD.
Absolutely.
And we're here to help.
Well, I appreciate it, and I appreciate your service. Thank you very much.
All right. We'll be here in case you have any further questions.
Why don't we go to public comment on this item now, if there is specific to this item? All right, the first card I have on this item is Mike O'Gara, followed by Noel Weiss. Mr. O'Gara, welcome.
Thank you and good afternoon. I'm very unhappy with this proposal from the mayor's office. Dunn needs a general manager. You can roll us into any department you wish, so long as we have our own department head. You wish to share, we need to share resources in 6 identified support positions. But if it's to be CDD/Dunn, then it needs to have 2 general managers, one for CDD and one for Dunn. The mayor's office has the person in charge of Dunn answering to an assistant manager. That's an insult. And how is that person going to go to the assistant manager and say, can I set this policy? Can I go to this meeting? That's dreadful. The Dunn was created by millions of votes from the voters of Los Angeles. CDD was created by less than 24 votes. We're not the smallest department. We are the most inexpensive department. We're the department that gives the city the best value, and we need to be a standalone. Now, we heard the gentleman from... Okay.
Finish your thought, sir.
All right. We heard the gentleman come up here from CDD, and they said they would have to apply for federal funding to get this. One gentleman said that he's going to charge 10% of his time. Maybe he should be furloughed 2 days a month if he's got 10% of his time to devote to us. This is not. I mean, obviously, we know we haven't had time to think it out thoroughly. But CDD has basically said that they would have to get more money and hire more people. So I don't understand how that's going to work out. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Noah Weiss, followed by Barbara Monahan-Burke. Mr. Weiss.
Council member, a couple of key points. One, in following up on Mike's comment, I think it should be, it's really just the reverse. All of the problems that were discussed, CDD should roll into Dunn. That would, I think, account for all of the issues that they discussed. And I don't have the time to go into detail on that, but think about it. And I think also a good analytical construct that I would recommend for your consideration, Councilman, is 2 core questions. Who gets what and why, and what are we doing and why? And I think if you go through in your own mind and evaluate that analytical construct, I think we can get to the right result. Some of these issues relative to management, day-to-day management versus policy, openness and transparency will take care of it. If you have a general manager who basically reports to a board, and basically that board, under 217 of the charter, they have the ability to subpoena, they have the ability to hold open hearings, they can pretty much gather the information. And that openness and transparency, I think, will go a long ways toward effectuating the desired result. One also key point, 911 of the charter, okay? The funding guarantee, there has to be, and nobody has talked about this, a funding guarantee for the neighborhood councils. Their right to funding 2 years in advance, as we talked about, this is in the charter, but
that's not related to this agenda item. But I've heard your point on that. I'll hear it again, but just not right now.
Well, okay, but in terms of the roll-in, well, people did comment on the fact that, hey, where's the funding going to come from? How are we going to do this? The CDD can't do it. You know what? If you guarantee a block grant, in effect, to this, what I would call this new Board of Community Empowerment and Development, and have CDD rolled into that, then effectively, I think you've guaranteed and you've solved your problem that way.
Okay, thank you. Next speaker is Barbara Monahan-Burke, followed by Glenn Bailey.
Barbara Monahan-Burke, Studio City Neighborhood Council Board Member. The CDD will not have the neighborhood councils as their priority. they were talking about 5 to 15% of the time of various general managers, assistant general managers, whatever, as allocated. These people already have full-time jobs, and they're going to squeeze us in, is what it looks like. That's absolutely unacceptable. We need an independent neighborhood council department. And at least it's been cleared up since Saturday when Larry Frank was at a meeting with a lot of neighborhood councils. The paperwork had said that with CDD we would be useful as a volunteer corps. And the functions of neighborhood councils are in the charter, as you know, with the functions, our existence, and our funding, what is necessary. And we as neighborhood councils have to have that. I have given you a sheet, 3 sheets of paper. I hope you have them. I've given it to you before. If not, I'll give your person that again to explain a lot of these high points of functions. Would you like me to give another one?
Sure.
Okay, I will. Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much for your sincere interest.
Thank you. Next speaker is Glenn Bailey, followed by a card that doesn't have a name on it, but it someone from Midtown NoHo. Is that Mary? Yeah. Okay. I thought so. Okay, you're after Mr. Bailey.
Good afternoon. In grading Dunn and Bonk, I would give them an A for certification process, a B for training, very good. For funding, I'd give them a D, needs to improve. The reality is, I have to commend Mr. Kim and Mr. Frank for involving, at some level, the neighborhood council representation in this process. To my mind, this has some potential pluses and minuses. The thing that I'm discouraged about in the past has nothing to do with all the personalities currently in place, but when I have brought things to the attention of the general manager of Dunn or his subordinates in the past, again prior to Mr. Kim and as well as the current administration, and to Bonk, many of those things were not addressed, swept under the rug, and really, frankly, didn't come into full public light until the controller's audit came out and really put emphasis on them. Perhaps if there is a structure where there's someone above the person responsible for Dunn, such as a general manager or assistant general manager, and perhaps if there's some way of holding Bonk more accountable to input it receives to act on it, or to cause action to be occurred, we can eliminate or reduce these situations that you know about that have come to light, and we can prevent them from reoccurring. More about that later.
Okay, thank you.
Mary Garcia, Midtown North Hollywood Neighborhood Council.
And as of this moment, Ms. Garcia is the last card that I have on item 1. Are there any others?
There's one more.
Okay, all right.
I oppose merging the neighborhood council system with CDD. I think they're a wonderful organization, and they deal with some very serious matters in the city regarding our people. But I don't believe that neighborhood councils belong there. I think that we need to be a separate entity, as we have been. I'd rather see us at the mayor's office or with a foundation. I have had personal experiences on a project with CDD, and when you're talking fiscal receivers and you're talking money going here, from there to me, to the, and back and forth, it takes a very, very, very long time. Neighborhood councils cannot operate that way. Sometimes we need something that's immediate within a month or two. That's not going to happen ever again. I think another very important question is, and no one has talked about it, is how much longer are neighborhood councils going to be funded? We're doing all of this, and this happened to me, by the way, with another city agency. Regional arts councils came into fruition some time ago. It was at the end of 1990. And we were supported by a cultural affairs department with a promise of $35,000 when we became a nonprofit, because there were 9 of us. Let me explain. There were 9 of us that had these regional arts councils, and we had to go through a great deal to become that. And I was the project manager on that. It never came to fruition. The $35,000 never appeared. And we were just dropped like a hot potato to fend for ourselves, and my Regional Arts Council was the only one to become a nonprofit. We need to know, where is the money and when is it going to stop? Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, and as of now, the last speaker I have on item 1 is Jay Handel. Mr. Handel.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon. Jay Handel from the West Los Angeles Neighborhood Council. A couple issues just running right down your list here. Feasibility of transferring administration of funding unit to city clerk or whichever agency. You know, the reality is putting it into a nonprofit makes no sense. As I said at Bonk last night, you know, it's all about how you set it up. Dunn has been set up to fail from day one. The funding program has been set up to fail from day one. And Bonk, quite frankly, has been set up not to be successful from day one due to the lack of teeth, its authority, its ability to enforce things that are on the books that don't get enforced. We have a group that has submitted a package of funding to the mayor's office. I think we submitted it also to your office to look at of how funding could work. We would like to work to show how it can stay in-house, feasible with limited staff. Bonk, give it teeth. Whatever you have to do, give it some teeth, because this system will never flourish under any situation if we don't have an authoritative body that can make sure that those rules are in effect can actually be enacted on. Because right now I could give you a number of specifics, Mr. Chair, of instances where ethics violations happen that nobody can do anything about it. It's a whole package of failure that we're looking at this point. And I have to just ask on the rollover funds, okay? Better.
Sorry.
Okay.
Actually, the rollover funds are not part of this agenda item.
Oh, it's on number 2.
Yeah.
I had thought it was put together. I'll be back.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. If there are no other speakers on item number 1, thank you all. Did we have? Yeah. This has been I think, a very healthy part of what will be a continuing dialogue on how we move forward on this. I'd like to move this item forward to next week's hearing as well, continue it to next week's hearing to allow more development of some of these ideas. And I'd like to ask, if possible, by next week, and I know it may be a bit much to ask, but if the city attorney can report back with a written opinion by next week on the legal issues surrounding what has been discussed, consolidation of a charter department like this, whether you've indicated that you have come to some comfort level, but I'd like to have that nailed down a little bit more, the legality of Dunn being consolidated with CDD, the legality of the funding program being managed by a nonprofit organization and what restrictions there may be in our ability to do that. The list that we talked about of the currently codified ordinances that would need to be amended if we do a consolidation like this. And then finally, the similar to the issue relating to transferring the administration of the funding program to a nonprofit, what legal restrictions might there be to transferring those management and administration responsibilities to Bonk?
Yeah, I think we can accommodate that. The only thing we'll have to get really clear on is what they have in mind in terms of this nonprofit and what taking over means.
And what specific responsibilities would be encompassed within that. Yeah, and I think that, perhaps you can consult with the mayor's office, the CAO, to try to develop that a little bit more. And then also I'd like to ask the CAO and CDD and the mayor's office really to provide by next week a consolidated funding program proposal that would address some of the logistical issues that we have in transferring the funding program. And I'd like consideration to be given to different options for handling it, this transferring the administration of the funding program to the nonprofit, transferring it to bonk, possibly the issues of how the funding program will be administered. There's been, has the motion, signed motion been introduced? Okay. There has been a discussion, for example, of the funding program coming from a single pot of money and then being handled more like a grant program. I'd like to know the pluses and minuses of a program like that we can discuss next week. Related to that, there has been discussion about the pros and cons of a more standardized application process for the funding program and further definition on what are appropriate categories for funding, that expenditures to be made by the funding program. So I'd like the CAO, CDD, and Mayor's Office to opine on that as well by next week. And then with regard to the budgetary aspects of this, I'd like to put a finer point on the staffing requirements that will be needed during the transitional period, because what we have is a proposal that we may decide may or may not work going forward, but in the interim period of transition, there's going to be increased demand for services, and there's going to be greater challenges, I think, in meeting them. So what will be the funding plan for how we move forward through the transitional period? Yeah, and then lastly, this is not so much something that needs to be reported back on next week, but Mr. Kim, the discussion that you had about your technology proposals, and I'd like to make sure that CDD follows up with you in how we can ensure that those are transitioned in and implemented. Oh, yeah, and then finally, I think for CAO and CDD and done, by next week, I'd like to really have a clear timeline for how this transition would take place for each of the functions that are going to be transitioned. When exactly will, under the proposal, would CDD take over each of these responsibilities, and under that timeline, what would be the cost savings realized? And I think that's it for that item. So we're going to have a lot to talk about on this item again next week. So thank you all. That brings us to item 2 on the agenda.
Item number 2 is a done and CAO reports relative to the transfer and implementation of the rollover funds to the unappropriated balance account, subject to honoring contracts, committed projects, ongoing rent and leases, and unpaid bills upon providing documentation.
All right, and if I could ask Dunn and CAO to come forward, please. So if you can please start by just providing an overview of how we're attempting to implement the council's policy on the current year's rollover, and what issues that's presenting as we're attempting to implement that.
Bangwan Kim, Department of Neighborhood Empowerment, per the City Council's directive to apply rollover balances only to those items that were committed by the board or unpaid bills, outstanding contracts and leases. We issued 2 e-blasts to neighborhood councils, giving them a deadline of March 8th to give us their backup documentation, as well as documentation of board actions that were taken. So our plan is to come up with a figure that we will present to the CAO by March 10th in compliance with the council directive. Some of the issues that have surfaced in terms of concerns from neighborhood councils are that due to the fact that our department had frozen prior year rollover funds until we can finish the accounting work to reconcile and reach a true rollover remaining balance, that many neighborhood councils ended up using their paying for prior year's expenses out of current year's funds. So their concerns are, had those funds been available, then we would have taken actions to encumber them. So my response to them was that I didn't anticipate that this rollover policy would take effect, that the delay was simply due to the fact that we had never reconciled our figures from the beginning of the funding program, and that needed to be done. And that once our accounting work was completed, that they would have access to their rollover funds. But during that time, due to the council action, this change in policy has required us to shift the way that we manage the funds between current year's allocation and prior year's rollover.
Is there any practical way to go back and try to identify what expenditures from prior years are being paid out of current year allocations by those councils that are in the situation that you've described?
We could not do it from a central systems perspective because we don't track money by year. We just lump all money together. Some neighborhood councils do keep track of their money by year, so first in, first out is their understanding of how the funds were being administered, but in fact, our systems didn't account for that. So we don't have a central way of doing that. If council were to direct us to do that, the only way we could do that is to go back to the neighborhood council's financial records and go one by one to determine exactly how they saw allocating funds by year.
You were engaged, as I recall, in a review, a forensic accounting review of some of these, or all of these rollover expenditures. I recall that was going to be completed sometime this month. Can you tell us what the status of that is?
I had suspended that work due to the council policy that basically made the need to reach a more accurate rollover balance for every neighborhood council since the beginning of the program. It made that point moot because now the council policy is to apply rollover balances only to those funds that could be identified through the council action. So I recognize the need to do that because since the beginning of the funding program, we have never reconciled end-of-year figures for every neighborhood council. We relied on neighborhood councils stating that their rollover balance was such a figure, which we then incorporated into their next year's figure, and we use that more or less as the balance going forward. So when we had realized that we went back and one by one from the very beginning of every neighborhood council, all 89 accounts, we had to go through that forensic accounting exercise. And because of the staff shortages, it took much longer than anticipated. But basically it was suspended due to the council action.
Would your findings from that audit, though, be useful in identifying the sorts of situations that you're talking about now where a neighborhood council has spent current year dollars for prior expenses due to reliance on the availability of those rollover funds?
Again, I think it would be a combination of two things. It would be the results of a complete forensic accounting, but it would also be comparing that to the board actions that were taken, individual boards going by their records. So it would be a reconciliation of those two information sources.
Okay. And have you begun to receive claims for against the rollover funds for prior approved expenditures?
Yes, in addition to the two e-blasts that we had sent out over the past week, we're also following up with phone calls to all the neighborhood council boards to clarify what the policy is and to request the information by the deadline.
But I mean, have they started providing that documentation and requests to you? So of the 80, well, now 90 neighborhood councils, to which 89 have potential rollover funds. Of those 89, how many responses have you gotten?
Less than 10.
Okay. And can you approximate how many of those 89 have indicated to you that they will be submitting a claim but just not have yet, or are there some that are not going to be have indicated that they're not going to be submitting a claim? I'm just trying to get a sense of the anticipated flow that's going to be coming in the next week.
I don't have that information currently, but I could provide it to you probably on Monday.
Well, don't bother, because we'll be talking about it again next week anyways. And of the 10 that have come in, what do you know offhand how much the claims were?
No.
Oh, yeah. Now, one of the categories of expenses that neighborhood councils will be entitled to utilize the rollover funds for is bills that have previously been submitted for reimbursement through the department that have not yet been paid. What is the current status of getting those expenses back to the neighborhood council, get those processed and paid?
Prior years' bills, I believe, were still, I don't have that information. I know that our outstanding list of demand warrants is about 200 that we have to go through and complete the payment process for. Of that, I don't have information, which is last year's. I believe the funding manager had indicated that that was about 200,000 from prior years. That was unpaid bills.
Okay.
But I would have to confirm those figures.
And then ongoing contracts and leases is another category. Do you have a sense of what the anticipated next year's expense for contracts and leases that would be paid out of the rollover fund would be?
No, I don't have that currently, but I could provide that in our next report.
Okay. Okay. Any other anticipated issues in implementing this over the next week that you want to bring to our attention at this point?
I can't think of any currently.
Okay. And for the CAO's office, any comments on implementation of this policy, concerns about implementation of it, issues that you anticipate?
Councilmember Terry Sauer with the CAO's office. Not at this point. We've been working closely with your office and with Dunn, and we'll continue to do so as this process goes forward. And we'll work with the department to determine what that final number is, or final claims, if any, and if necessary, bring back recommendations.
Okay, thank you. We're gonna receive public comment on this matter now, but what I would like to do is request that our next hearing would be after the 8th, correct?
Our next hearing is Tuesday.
What's the date? Okay, so at our next hearing will be on the 9th. So the period by which you've asked for documentation will have passed the day before. If we could continue this discussion at that time, and you'll probably be able to provide a much clearer sense of what we can anticipate will have been processed. Correct. So I'd like to ask you to do that if I could, Mr. Kim. And then I'm further going to ask that well, we'll just continue this matter then until next week. But I think we will want to have obviously a final report and accounting in detail after the expiration of the rollover fund term on April 20th. We'll want to have, so I'm just giving you that heads up. We're going to want a detailed accounting of how those funds were distributed once that's been completed. So let's go ahead and take public comment on item number 2. We're not going to be taking any action on this item other than that. So, but let's go forward with public comment in any event. Thank you, all. The first card is from Barbara Monahan Burke, followed by Glenn Bailey.
Hi. Again, Barbara Monahan Burke, Studio City Neighborhood Council. I just want to say how important it is to continue with the rollover funding. I think at one point it was 3 years. Now I think it's 2. We need at least 2 years to continue forward so we can do major projects within the community. And we, because of all of this, have had to juggle around our responsibilities to the people, you know, that we owe money to. And it isn't good for our name or for the city. So as soon as we can clear this up, the better. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Glenn Bailey, followed by Mary Garcia.
Glenn Bailey, and I'm a board member of the Encino Neighborhood Council. I have taken the treasurer's training several times, just for the record, although I've never served as treasurer, and I am on our finance committee. I just want to bring a couple things to your attention that I think are of concern. First of all, apparently some demand warrants that were submitted towards the end of last fiscal year were not processed until after the end of that fiscal year, and therefore those monies were taken out of this fiscal year's $45,000 allocation, which certainly wasn't the intention, I think, for any parties. They were voted on by the neighborhood councils in last fiscal year. They were submitted last fiscal year, and it's not their fault that they were then paid. And as I'm reading some of these languages, it's referencing unpaid bills, but these were paid. So I think there should be some accounting adjustments for those situations. In addition to that, and I'm not sure how to deal with this, can I?
Finish the thought.
Is that there were some, well, first of all, Dunn advised neighborhood councils that they were going through this process to prepare a budget for this fiscal year of $45,000 and do not rely on the rollover until they'd finished their accounting. They were told it would take a couple of months, i.e. into August. Then they said it would be September, October, November. And the target kept moving. Some of these expenditures, some neighborhood councils, including Encino, I believe, opted to pay for some of the bills, rightly or wrongly. I'm not condoning it, but they wanted to get some of these vendors and community folks, including schools, paid, and so they used other sources, which then were attributed by in other words, the purchase card or the petty cash, which would then come out of their current fiscal year. And it seems to me that if a neighborhood council could demonstrate by the minutes, by the actions, it was a prior year authorization, that those should also be included as a payment, as it accounted towards that prior fiscal year. That's, and I don't believe that's covered in the motion, or maybe it needs to be clarified, but I think that was clearly, that's clearly the intent, and I think it's unfair because of that so-called, I mean, it wasn't just the freeze, it was saying it's going to happen, and then ultimately this all happened, and it's just, you know, I think there needs to be some clarification of that, and you only have till March 8th to make that clarification.
Thank you. Next speaker is Mary Garcia, followed by Noel Weiss.
Hi, again. I was trying to reach our treasurer. I haven't had a chance to speak with her, but I think she had something to say on this, and I haven't been able to get a hold of her, so it'll have to come up at another point.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. You're always welcome. Mr. Weiss, followed by Jay Handel. And that's my last card on item number 2.
See, the clock's already rolling. Oh, there, okay. You know what? I wanted to read this in the record. This is from the budget, mayor's budget of last year. If the neighborhood council, basically, if a neighborhood council enrolls during a fiscal year, its appropriation is prorated based on the quarter during which it enrolls. On June 22nd, 2005, the City Council adopted a policy through which individual unspent neighborhood council fund balances would roll over at the end of each fiscal year for a period of time not to exceed 3 years from the date of initial allocation. On December 18, 2007, the City Council approved a modification to ensure that the neighborhood councils shall not have more than $150,000 available funds at any given time. Policy provides that at the end of each fiscal year, the appropriation for each neighborhood council shall be reduced to $100,000. Going forward, I think in terms of how we can solve this problem, again, let's not try to make, again, the simple complex. I think basically going forward, if you just simply provide for an internal dispute resolution mechanism, you basically say, you know what, go forward, subject to the right of the city basically to claw back. Later on, give them a year, figure out, okay, during the course of that year, you tell us what you think you're entitled to, we'll tell you what we think you're entitled to, and if we can reach agreement, fine. If not, have the controller basically be a referee to decide between what the neighborhood council wants versus what the city feels that it's entitled to, and subject to a 245, let's say, before the city council. And you know what? Probably in the span of a year, you'll get it all resolved.
Thank you. Mr. Handel.
Thank you. Rollover, West LA. We were good stewards of our money. We had no rollover until they created one. Because our bills were put in on time, because our bills were all laid out correctly, check-boxed on the form that we created to ensure that everything was supposed to be there, was there in the package, and then the city froze the money. 2 months later, they paid our bills against this year's budget. So that means if we don't get that money back, there will be no concerts in the park, there will be no Shakespeare Festival, there will be no more outreach, because over $15,000 of our money has gone to this year's budget from last year's budget. Let me make this suggestion, because I know that they have to know how much money they took from our budget, because they called us and told us it's coming from your next year's budget to pay these bills. I would suggest, much like you're doing with the past bills that are outstanding that haven't been paid, I would suggest you ask the department to supply every neighborhood council with a computer run from the day of the freeze to date of every demand warrant that was paid. Put it back on the neighborhood councils and ask the neighborhood councils to compare that to the warrants that were submitted. You have to know that from that day forward, everything that was paid came from this year's budget, not from last year's budget, whether it's the controller or whomever. But we can then go back and look at the warrants we submitted and know which ones were from last year that were paid this year, and give us that drop-dead date, maybe coinciding with the first item, and allow us to submit that and have that money put back in as part of, call it either the rollover or just refund the money for this year, but keep it fair. Because when it's all said and done, the neighborhood councils did the right thing in this instance, and I know we get blamed for doing a lot of wrong things, but we did the right thing and we're being penalized for doing the right thing, and ultimately all of your constituents get penalized at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you. That makes sense. And for the sake of the record, Mr. Handel, there's no question about it that whatever we do budgetarily, it's going to be penalizing important, vital services that neighborhood councils are providing to communities throughout the city, and it's going to be hurting this city's ability to provide the services that we're supposed to be providing, because neighborhood councils are an immense benefit in terms of the energy and volunteerism and eyes and ears and all of the other aspects that the city of Los Angeles benefits from the existence and vitality of our neighborhood councils. So I couldn't agree with you more that whatever we do that causes any reduction in the rollover or the annual allocation or in any other way detracts from neighborhood councils' ability to do what they've been doing. It does hurt our constituents and it does hurt our city. Sadly, that's true of just about everything that we're dealing with right now in the budget, and we're doing our best to wade our way through in the way that will cause the least harm. But I appreciate that very much. Thank you. So with that, we do have a written report that was provided by the department, so we will receive and file that, and then we'll come and revisit the issue again next week with further information. That brings us to item number 3.
You continued item number 3. I'm sorry, you continued item number 3.
We are continuing item number 3, but I wanted to have it read anyway so we can take any public comment there may be, and then we'll just defer it for action until next week.
Item number 3, Dunn and CL reports relative to the rollover policy and the recommendations to include a reporting process to either bank or city council.
And that item is being continued until next week. And if there is public comment, we'll take it. If not, we can do that next week. So, Mr. Bailey, you want to? Scratched out my number 3 when you said it wasn't. No, go ahead.
Glenn Bailey. I just wanted to let you know that I've spoken with Controller Gruhl a couple of times about the issue of rollover and the manageability for the city. And my personal position is if we could get a 1-year rollover, in other words, this year's funds and maybe one other year, that way we wouldn't be faced with spend it or lose it type of a mentality, and it might help also keep the accounting process simpler than having the 2-year. And I can't speak for the controller, but I strongly suggested that maybe she might want to submit something in writing to the council if she thought that that was, a possible compromise. So I just wanted to put that suggestion out there. So instead of no rollover, to have the 1 year, and that would also accommodate some of these other issues we just discussed about of things not being paid on time and that sort of thing.
Okay, thank you very much. If there's nothing else on item 3, that brings us to item number 4 on the agenda, and we are joined now by the Honorable Dennis Zine, who has been busily engaged in the Personnel Committee, and he told me that before we began this, so welcome. I'm glad you could make it, Mr. Zine, for this portion after your good work in Personnel. Sure. Item number 4.
2 hours in there Personnel.
Item number 4, Dunn report relative to an enforcement policy for the Neighborhood Council bank card system.
Mr. Kim, welcome back. If you could just, we've had a great deal of discussion, starting with the audit and since then about the bank card policies, and we talked about some options for that previously. Can you give an overview of what policies you're recommending to implement procedures to ensure accountability of that system, and what you've already done, what you recommend for further action to make sure that the bank card system continues to be something that can be utilized by the neighborhood councils, but still ensures proper fiscal accountability?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Bong Wan Kim, Neighborhood Empowerment. Good evening, Councilman Zine. I introduced myself earlier as still General Manager of Bong Wan Kim.
Continuing.
But this follows up on the findings of the controller's audit, which indicated some systemic weaknesses in the purchase card. And one of the early policies that we had established is to eliminate the petty cash. So we are currently, we closed out all the petty cash accounts officially as of March 1st, so neighborhood councils cannot pull out any cash from the purchase card. So we felt that that was the most easily implementable because all it requires is a web-based solution where we instruct the treasurer to instruct the bank that cash can no longer be withheld. So we felt that that was the most implementable policy recommendation and procedure. The others, in terms of the purchase card, in many ways, after receiving training from the treasurer on the database that the U.S. Bank has available, we have notified neighborhood councils that every treasurer of the neighborhood council is to register with U.S. Bank, and they have currently available data on every purchase card for every neighborhood council. So it would be relatively simple for them to just print out that report, share it with the board on a monthly basis. I could require that, but in terms of implementing and enforcement follow-up is where we fall short because of the staff shortages. So I would, we're working closely with CDD, but, one idea would be to have all of the funding be used just through the purchase card, eliminate demand warrants, which would address the staff workload issue, and just tighten up the board authorization policy and procedure on a monthly basis, and then our staff could just have a checklist every month. Did your board approve these expenditures or not? And if you didn't, why not? If you don't have an explanation after 2 months, then we freeze your funds until you can do that.
Interesting. So in this respect, we're talking about creating greater accountability than we had before by making greater use of the very bank card system that was the source of so much angst.
Correct.
Okay. I'm glad you mentioned the monthly statements. This is something that generates a degree of accountability and record keeping that the city doesn't need to play any role in whatsoever. The bank is producing a monthly statement. Right. And while I perfectly understand that your staffing limitations might not make you able to go out and beat the bushes and identify what those expenditures were and enforce violations, still there's going to be a record that's going to be available on a monthly basis that can be subpoenaed, that can be put in a file in the department, that will in itself, the existence of that statement in itself will be an inhibiting factor that's going to deter any likelihood of abuse by that system, it seems to me.
We believe so. Followed up by a policy from the city that would require every board to review and approve the financials on a monthly basis. So, sunshine being the best disinfectant, the more eyes that are looking at the numbers, it reduces the likelihood of abuse.
Mr. Zine, any questions on the bank cards?
I think it is a perfect solution to the problem. I would hope that the neighborhood councils would demand a receipt for whatever items. For example, you see the charge, and it shows Target, it shows Home Depot, it shows whatever the case may be for a certain amount, and that the neighborhood council, the treasurer, would require a receipt for every expenditure. So you can look at that receipt and see exactly, oftentimes it says what was purchased. Or if it was for Domino's Pizza, well, you ordered 10 pizzas, what for? So once that receipt is there attached to that statement, now you've got it connected. I know when I do my own purchases, I get a receipt, I get the statement, I match them up, and I've found sometimes errors on the bank's part.
Right.
But this keeps, I think, it crystal clear. You don't have a receipt, that charge won't be accepted. You got to have a receipt. I think it clarifies a lot of the issues. But I think the warrant situation was too cumbersome. The cash created a problem. I think this is a fail-safe system, especially when you've got that neighborhood council reviewing that, the board reviewing that on a monthly basis. And then how you support that. If you don't have an answer in 2 months, we're going to shut off your money. So that will give them the opportunity as a board to say, obviously someone's not doing what they're supposed to do. And how many cards would be issued to each neighborhood council?
Currently, they're still allowed to have 2.
Okay.
And about 45 have 2, the rest have 1.
Okay. And the board would have to control that, the person who's
Correct.
makes the purchase. So I think it's a great solution, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, thank you.
If I may, Peter King, City Attorney's Office, just for your consideration, one interesting wrinkle, if you will, is the demand warrants in large measure were used for items, larger items that they were contracting for. And these are city contracts, anything over $1,000, a city attorney's supposed to sign off on the contract, and they're supposed to comply with all the city's social contracting rules that attach to any contract. The department historically has entered into those contracts on their behalf. So if you're talking about paying for larger ticket items, you would essentially be with the card, you would essentially be circumventing the city's contracting rules if they were just allowed to purchase or enter into a personal services contract for $30,000, let's just say, and pay for it through the card. So I think at this point there's still that element of demand warrant, because that's exactly what the controller was looking for, is an invoice or some contract number in which they could issue the demand warrant.
Right, and the paper trail part of this is addressed, I think, by this policy, especially with, as Mr. Zine suggested. By the way, what is the current requirement for documentation of purchases on the bank card, as Mr. Zine is referring to,
Right.
for submitting receipts for, if it's a purchase for food?
Yes.
Are they required, as we are, to say who dined and how many people participated in that sort of thing? What are the documentation requirements, first of all?
That would come through the quarterly audits, which submissions, which would include, had include petty cash, all purchase card transactions, and we do require receipts. We had been using missing receipt affidavits, which some neighborhood councils had been abusing, and so we eliminated that. But current policy is that neighborhood councils have to include receipts with all of their purchase card transactions. Okay. Now, whether they comply or not is not known, because we're 250 audits behind.
Now, the separate issue that Mr. King is raising is this contract issue. There are compliance, all sorts of contract administration issues that the city needs to take into account. How could we balance your recommendation with those needs?
Well, I would think that we could approach it one of two ways. One would be to just limit the use of demand warrants in those situations. Secondly, we would require, if there were neighborhood councils that would, if we wanted to rely all on purchase cards, we would have to increase the dollar limit threshold. And whether certain vendors in terms of consultants could use purchase cards as a way to receive payments. You know, PayPal, a lot of people use PayPal, so in these days it's kind of unusual not to be able to use a purchase card to complete most transactions. But we would have to make sure that neighborhood councils are, when they are entering into agreements, to make sure that has been approved, by the department and by the city. But we still may be able to find a way to pay them through the purchase cards, as long as the contract approval process was sanctioned by the city.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much, Mr. Kim. Let's go ahead and take public comment, if there is any, on item 4. There is. First speaker on item 4 is Barbara Monahan Burke, followed by Glenn Bailey. And then Mary Garcia, and then Mike O'Gara, and that's all the cards I have at the moment on item 4.
Barbara Monahan Burke, Studio City Neighborhood Council. We do approve our records for money every month from our treasurer, and just wanted you to know that, our budget people. And it's a good policy to do that. It's not difficult, so it's not a burden to do that. I know that the demand warrant system is cumbersome and it takes a long time, so the card is what is preferred by our council. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Bailey.
Glenn Bailey and Senior Neighborhood Council. We do not receive monthly reports every single month, and that should occur, and so if we can get that as a requirement. And I think there should be zero tolerance. I think that if a neighborhood council doesn't do the monthly financials given to all board members, and I would also add the requirement that they post it on their website. If they fail to do that, zero tolerance, cut off the funding. As a enforcement mechanism for everything. There's a couple of important points I think you should consider. First of all, the demand warrant allows the enforcement of compliance with the business tax registration certificate, so that you know if you're dealing with a vendor doing business within the city of Los Angeles that they have the proper registration with the Office of Finance. When you use the credit card or the purchase card, you no longer have that assurance. And I think that's important for the city to make sure that you're getting the business taxes that you are expecting. It's an arm of enforcement, and we've seen how that's circumvented with the split transactions that have occurred that the controller brought out, and that is related to the demand warrant. The city attorney says it's $1,000 threshold. Sorry to go on, but if there's $1,000 threshold, and the neighborhood councils, and some of them with good intention because of delays and meetings, but they circumvented that $1,000 threshold, which was to use the demand warrant for various enforcement, including the business tax, by doing multiple transactions day after day after day to the same vendor to pay a $5,000 bill that should have gone through a demand warrant. So what you need to think about, in my opinion, is what is that limit of a demand warrant? If the city attorney says it's 1,000, maybe you don't have any jurisdiction of that. Then what is the limit of the purchasing card? Right now it's a quarterly limit based on 1/4 of the annual allocation, 1/4 of 45,000. Maybe it should be a monthly limit, but it would depend on if we still have a demand warrant option to pay those big bills. I think I've covered everything I needed to, but I do the enforcement to the neighborhood councils, the monthly reporting, the transparency of requiring it be on their websites too, as well as Dunn's website, and the vote of approval in the minutes is very important.
Thank you. Ms. Garcia, followed by Mr. O'Gara, and that's the last card I have.
Mary Garcia, Midtown North Hollywood Neighborhood Council. We really don't have a problem on my neighborhood council regarding treasury and funds, but I do want to say that cash on hand, petty cash is really necessary. I cannot tell you how many times I have put out cash because we're at a meeting and we're having an event and we've run out of water. We do this and, the person holding the card can't be there. And so in any case, I think that we still need to keep petty cash on hand for just that instance because you can't pay me with PayPal. Okay.
Thank you. Mr. O'Gara.
The petty cash problem, that's sometimes solved by having the two credit cards, because I'm retired and if somebody needs something, I go and buy it with the credit card. So that eliminates, we haven't used petty cash for 2 years. But I agree that we should go with the purchase card. I also think the demand warrants have a place, and we need to set a limit on the purchase card. Either I'd like to see it at 2,500, but we could probably live with 2,000. But and also definitely zero tolerance. And starting on next Tuesday at our neighborhood council in Sun Valley, we'll be reporting all financial transactions.
Very good. Thank you very much, sir. If there's no other public comment on that matter, we're going to continue this matter until next week to allow CDD the opportunity to weigh in with comments on the department's report. And I'd also like, Mr. King, if we could next week, get a little bit more definition about how we can address the concerns that you raised, which I think are important. And next week I'd like to really be able to develop a policy that accommodates those concerns, as well as the accountability issues that we've identified. So if there's no objection, we'll just continue.
I'd like to just make a comment on respect to the folks that spoke regarding the cash, the credit card, et cetera. Some people don't think it's a problem. I will tell you it has been a problem. Some people are going to jail. That's what kind of a problem it is. While your neighborhood council may not be a problem, there have been neighborhood councils that have been a problem as a result of an audit and not every neighborhood council was audited. And I don't want to see anybody go to jail. I don't want to see any neighborhood council get embarrassed, but it has happened. And I don't believe the cash needs to be a part of it. I'm very committed to keeping it a clean, safe, transparent system. If we submit a receipt for whatever we do, if it's a dining experience, you've got to submit what you had to eat. You have to submit that check, not just $10 at some location, but exactly what you had to eat.
And who was there?
Huh?
And who was there?
And who was there. So, I mean, we do it. It's transparent. Somebody wants to see it. It's easier to just take the money out of your pocket sometimes and pay for it. But I know that there's neighborhood council members here who are very concerned about being honest, having the integrity. But understand, with 90 neighborhood councils, not everyone has that same attitude or philosophy. So we have to err on the side of caution on behalf of the taxpayers that are in charge of the city of Los Angeles, along with the ones who are elected to make sure things run smooth. I wanted that on the record. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And you know, that's one of the issues that, one of the challenges that we have as a result of these audit findings is that we want to make sure, and most of the neighborhood councils and their participants want to make sure that we are very, very judicious in pursuing our fiduciary obligations to maintain accountability and proper use of the taxpayers' money. And all the neighborhood council members that I know are very much committed to that. But clearly there have been exceptions. There have been situations that have come up where, you know, whether out of inadvertence, inexperience, or ill intent, there have been abuses of this system. I think the reason that developing this policy effectively is so important is we want to make sure that we have that accountability, but we also want to make sure that we don't use those, we don't create a situation where those problems that have developed are used as a way to stifle the vitality of the neighborhood council system. And so what we're shooting for here is to try to find the policy that allows the continuing function of neighborhood councils, the robust activity that they've engaged in, while still, you know, the maximum degree of accountability that we can provide. So with that, we're going to continue that matter until next week, and then that brings up general public comment. Our two cards that I have for general public comment so far are Noel Weiss and Glenn Bailey. Mr. Weiss.
Okay, my comments generally are as follows. Number one, I'm concerned generally about this process about the using the crisis to consolidate further power in the mayor's office. The commissions are really the checks and balances. That was part of the initial charter, and I just would like this committee and the city council, I think, to be sensitive to that concern. Also, relative to, so therefore, for example, anything that's done, it should be subject to audit. If it goes in the mayor's office, it's not subject to audit necessarily. I think that should be a consideration. Plus, obviously, this idea of the funding considerations and guaranteeing the funds for the neighborhood councils, because that's the core of citizen empowerment. What I'm giving you, gentlemen, is the neighborhood empowerment fund from the prior 3 or 4 years of the mayor's budgets. My key there is, Mr. Krikorian, what I ask you to do is to consider agendizing the item of where the $5.6 million went. I think it just kind of disappeared. I don't think anybody stole it. I don't think there was a problem. But you know what? Somebody, maybe it was when Laura Chick left, before Laura Chick left and Wendy Gruhl came in. But you know what? Wendy Gruhl needs to be down here. She needs to basically say, where did that money go? Because the bottom line is, because of the 9/11 provision of the charter, that money needs to go back into that lockbox, and it should not be lost forever. It's wrong. And okay, I mean, just a minute. If I could just make 2 other quickies, could I?
Real quick.
Okay, real quick. 908 of the charter. It would help you a lot. City Council has the authority. It's never been used, but I think now's the time to use it. Empower a group of neighborhood council people. Send them out in the city and say, you know what, advise us. Even Larry Frank said, what's the primary role of the neighborhood council? To advise. Empower them under 908, have them do it, and then you know what, when we have hearings, the public gets like 3 minutes or 5 minutes, and the city gets like an hour. I mean, maybe balance it out so that you can get something back that'll give you a greater degree of balance, because honestly, once you're here, and you're going to be here for a while, you guys start talking with each other, and then we really do have, problems, and it's the same old, same old. Lastly, when we're talking CDD, I think Herb Wesson's committee has jurisdiction over CDD. I'm not sure, but I think it does. And you know what? I think anything involving CDD should also go before HCED, assuming that, or whatever committee the city council has jurisdiction over it, so that that can be vented there as well and give the public, a better shot. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Bailey.
Thank you for your time and attention. Glenn Bailey, Senior Neighborhood Council. Want a little bit change subject. I want to talk about Neighborhood Council elections, specifically starting with yesterday's election. It was encouraging to hear that Woodland Hills Warner Center had over 1,000 people participate in that election. I haven't heard the results of.
I was there and I heard it was 500.
500? Okay.
I was told when I
was that at the end of the day?
I was there at 8 o'clock.
Okay. Well, then the president exaggerated, but okay. Anyway, the comment I just wanted to make was that in the debate over the the motion regarding city clerk no longer doing it, the city clerk told the full council that they only had 12 volunteers that came forward to be volunteer poll workers at the testimony before city council. I was one of those 12 people. I signed up at the Valley Congress that was held last May 30th, that when they first rolled this out. And I had been called several times, as you probably know, including last December and January. And at that point, I said, I'll do Region A, the West Valley and North Valley. Let me know when I can do it. Then I get the email 12 days ago, 11 days before the election, saying, that went out to everyone, saying if you want to be a volunteer poll worker, fill out this form, even though I'd signed this up and I'd never said that before, and you have to do a training 30 days prior to the election. And here's notice coming out 11 days before the election. I'm sharing this with you because yesterday we did a tally. There were 45 city clerk employees total staffing the 11 neighborhood council elections, 0 volunteer poll workers. They have had since last May, when this committee, your predecessor and the other members in this committee directed them to initiate a volunteer poll worker program since last May, and there was 0 in Region A. They're supposed to be, they spent $400,000 since the beginning of February of the $1.9 million. They are making no efforts to try to save that money if they've got 0 volunteer poll workers. So I'm just saying, I know you're having them report back to you in 120 days, but by then all the other regions will have come and gone.
Let me respond to that, Mr. Chair. I was at the Woodland Hills. I got there at 8 o'clock, just before 8 o'clock, like 10 minutes to 8, and I was at the West Hills because I voted in the West Hills and I also voted in the Woodland Hills. There were a lot of city staff there. There were some volunteers, and I drafted a motion today that was been submitted that we have a review shortly on the results, since it was basically my council district where this took place, the number of personnel, what the results were, et cetera. So I have, and they told me that the lady who was running the Woodland Hills said there were 500 that showed up. She showed me the sheets. I know one of them, I went to Canoga Park. They were already closed. I heard their hours were 12 to 6 instead of 12 to 8. I never got to Winnetka, but I tried to make my rounds to the ones out in the West Valley. But we're getting a report as a result of a motion to make sure that this $1.9 million is spent wisely. I don't know if those folks were on overtime, but they had a number of city folks, clerks, that were at the Woodland Hills at the fire station on Burbank, in addition to volunteers. There were volunteers at both places. Numbers I can't tell you, but it was kind of like the end of the day when there seemed to be a rush on people that were out there. And there were also folks that were soliciting, directing, shall we say, in front of the fire station, who were candidates. Now, I don't know if that's appropriate or not, to candidates to direct you in. So anyway, we're going to get a report into this committee, but I did the motion and submitted it today.
Yeah, and the charge of the council was, yes, that there would be a report back that we could learn from for next year, but also in the interim, that the clerk was instructed to find ways to economize and reduce costs. So I'm glad to hear about this, because we are going to be pursuing that even between now and 120 days from now as well.
There were originally 6 at Woodland Hills, and they, as I've been told, they brought in additional, because of the turnout, they brought in additional.
She said they were out the door and that they brought in. She did say that the lady from the clerk's office said they brought in additional staff. I don't know where they got them from, but
I'm afraid we can't have a continuing dialogue without
we will next
an
time.
Agenda item, but we will soon. Thank you, Mr. Bailey. Thank you, everyone. If there's nothing further, nothing else we need to do, then we are adjourned. Thanks very much.
Thank you.